Hey everybody, Mr. Moffin coming at you again with another APGov video. We're continuing our tour of topic 1.7, focusing in on the relationship between the states and the federal government. Now, last time we introduced the concept of cooperative federalism. The idea being is that the federal and the state and the local governments working together to address shared policy matters. And we spent, a lot of time focusing in on the example of public education. Before we move on and start talking about block grants, I did want to kind of come back to, maybe another example to kind of help you visualize and understand how these different levels of government might work together on an issue outside of public education. And, one example I thought of was hurricane recovery. So you can see, when you look at a devastating hurricane like you see depicted here, this is where you see the federal government, the state governments, and the local governments having to work collectively and in a very fast, very rapid, almost frantic pace to address a very, very pressing, dangerous issue. So, for example, if you're thinking about a hurricane situation like this, at the federal level you have FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Administration. That federal agency is responsible for allocating, it could be billions of dollars to a particular state or region to help cover the cost of cleanup. Now note, this is federal money, and they will sometimes also bring in federal structures, like trailers and stuff like that. But where it starts to become, federalism, cooperative federalism, is that a lot of that money is handed over to the states. And so the states will be given, let's say, for example, a state like Florida following a hurricane, is given a couple $2 billion. That state of Florida, for example, would then take that money and help to cover the cost of, for example, housing shelters, potable drinking water, providing makeshift areas for schools and things like that to help with that kind of an issue. You've also got local government playing a role as well. I mentioned, perhaps money to help with local schools. Well, the local schools then have to make decisions in terms of, well, how do you accommodate public education needs, for example, following a hurricane? Another issue that is very common associated with natural disasters is looting. So who do you turn to? Well, at the national level, you've got the U.S. Army, for example. You got state militias. You've also got the local police that all work together on that same issue. So understand that, federalism is applied in so many different areas of policy. So I just wanted to kind of go back and just kind of give you another example there. Anyhow, last time we were here, we were talking about categorical grants, the idea that it's federal money that influences state powers and policy with strings attached. The idea being is the states need money, the federal government wants influence, and that's how that works out. Now, that being said, not all federal grant money comes with those very, very specific strings attached, like a categorical grant. We also have the existence of what we call block grants. A block grant is money that is awarded to states with few to no strings attached. So, if we're talking about, once again, public education, we mentioned the idea that the federal government might believe that the most pressing issue for public education is academic achievement, and states will be given money for standardized testing to assess student achievement. But individual states might say, like here in Ohio, they might say, well, that's not really what we think is the pressing issue. It might be, meeting the needs of low-income students by providing free and reduced breakfast and lunch programs. Well, with a block grant, there is more of a sense that the federal government is trusting the states to do what they feel is best with that money. And so the idea being is that, the federal government might tell with a block grant, here, Ohio, here's $1 billion. You know what your needs are. You spend it however you see fit. We trust you. Because in a state like Ohio, it might be issues with free and reduced lunch programs. Other states, it might be access to technology, like, for example, covering the cost of, laptop devices. So it just kind of depends on what state you're living in. When we talk about the ideological and party breakdown in terms of support, conservative Republicans tend to support block grants more than categorical grants. Part of this is the idea that conservative Republicans tend to have more of an idea that states should have more power in this federalism relationship, not necessarily superior to the federal government, but more relative power than what liberals might, liberal Democrats might assert. So the idea being is that, let the states be the ones to decide what they need, and let the federal government be the friend to help them financially to make the decisions that they think is best, and not have a federal government kind of intrude and tell them what to do. Now, that being said, there's a reality of kind of what happens with this money. And this is what we call creeping categorization. The idea being is that, if you're talking about the federal government giving money to the states, for whatever reason, almost always this money eventually morphs, even if it doesn't already start out this way, into some type of categorical grant. The federal government just can't help it. It's just the idea of, if you're going to give money to somebody, you're going to want to have an influence over it. So, for example, if you're as a student in college and your parents give you money while you're in college, let's say it's, several $1,000s, they're going to want to have influence over what you spend your money on. Even though you as the student might know what's best or think you know what's best, your parents are going to want to really have influence on how you spend that money. And that kind of speaks to how the federal government views the states. There's almost a paternalistic kind of mindset that the federal government has with regards to the states. Okay. Now, getting away from grants per se is another aspect of fiscal federalism, so to speak, and that is what we call, these are what we call mandates. A mandate is the use of federal authority through things like the things like the Commerce Clause, or things like the 14th Amendment, things that are part of the Constitution that could be very broadly expanded to give the federal government lots of authority on things that do pertain to the states. For example, through things like a broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause, the federal government has basically had the mindset that they can dictate to businesses rules regarding pollutants and emissions and things like that. So with that authority, we have seen the federal government through things like the Clean Air Act tell states that, hey, we're the federal government. We have authority over, pollutants that are emitted into the air by factories, and we're going to demand these emission standards that factories cannot exceed. Okay, fine and good. But what they do with a mandate is that they tell the state, you're going to be the ones to enforce this. We're creating the standard, you're going to enforce it. And the idea being is that, the government that's closer to that factory is going to be able to more effectively police it than, say, the federal government. Now, that might sound all fine and good from a federal perspective, but states very much bristle with these mandates because these mandates commonly are unfunded. So the idea might be is that, okay, state of, Wyoming, you're going to, police emissions of oil refineries out in Wyoming. But we're not giving you any money to make this happen. You're going to have to come up with the money to enforce this federal law. So, state governments really, really, really don't like that. They feel it's added burdens that are put on by the government using its authority. We also see this apply to things like, the enforcement of various civil rights acts and things like that. So understand that, the basic gist of it is that the federal government is flexing muscles to kind of make this happen. Now, sometimes they'll add, non-related assistance in other areas. Like they might say, hey, your states, you're going to enforce this environmental regulation, but then if you do that, we will provide you with funds for, like, say, highways or something like that. So that can sometimes play into it. But in many cases, there's the idea that states, you're going to have to enforce this, and you're going to have to come up with your own money to make that happen. Some modern examples of this in place, actual real examples. The Americans with Disabilities Act. That is the kind of the most well-known piece of federal legislation regarding to civil rights for those that are physically disabled. So, for example, today the federal government says that, hey, any type of structure, new structure since 1990, has got to meet with guidelines such as parking spaces for the handicapped, wheelchair ramps, elevators if you're on more than one floor, things like that. And if you are, for example, a school district and you are building a new school, you have to comply with all of these federal guidelines under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the money to pay for the elevators, the money to pay for the ramps and things like that. The railings for handicapped accessible toilets and braille signs and all that kind of stuff. That in many cases is going to be coming out of the money of the state governments and the local school district, even though it's a federal mandate that has to be applied. All right, now to kind of round this out, we're going to step away from kind of this, more traditional, modern sense of federalism, cooperative federalism, which certainly tends to have more of a liberal lean, generally speaking, and take a look at something that's much more in support of the mindset of conservatives. And this is what we call new federalism, kind of starting in the 1970s and 80s, and then into what we call devolution revolution, even though the devolution revolution is a 90s concept and certainly did get a lot of buy-in from moderate Democrats like Bill Clinton, for example, in the 1990s. It's generally the idea that, starting in the 1930s through the FDR era into the 1960s through the Great Society era of Lyndon Johnson, there was just more and more of a sense that the federal government was more and more encroaching on what the states were doing. That the federal government was using its vast power in terms of legal authority and financial resources to really kind of get into what the states were doing. And it kind of felt like the states were constantly looking over their shoulder and kind of being tapped on the shoulder and told what to do. States didn't really like this. And in particular, once again, conservatives tend to have more of a mindset that states should have a little bit more independence and authority to make decisions. And what this does is it's just kind of a general sense of trying to look out for the needs of states and limit what might be considered growing federal authority. Now, I'm not going to get into too much details here at the moment regarding that, but just kind of be mindful of this idea of new federalism, for example, as a conservative idea of reducing federal authority, giving states more authority. It's not in contradiction to cooperative federalism, but it is more of a way to kind of define what that relationship looks like. Whereas with more kind of traditional cooperative federalism, liberal Democrats are kind of more willing to exert more of that federal authority over the states in the name of things like protecting civil rights and making sure that no one is the victim of bad state policies and things like that. Okay? All right, so that's going to round it out for topic 1.7. We will see you next time.